our next presenter is our keynote speaker, Professor Jonathan Jansen, and Prof. Maria is going to do the introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It is my great honor and privilege to welcome Professor Jonathan Jansen. Like many of you, he has played a key role in inspiring a lot of my thinking about teaching and learning. Today, he's going to be speaking to us with a talk entitled, What Lockdown Learning Tells Us About the Future of Education, Insights from 164 Student Stories. Professor Jansen is Distinguished Professor of Education at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. He is President of the South African Academy of Science, Knight Hensey Fellow at Stanford University. His recent books include edited and co-authored collections, South African Schooling, The Enigma of Inequality, 2019, Decolonizing in Universities, The Politics of Knowledge, 2019, Fault Lines, a premiere on Race, Science and Society, 2020, Who Gets In and Why, Race, Class and Aspiration in South Africa's Elite Schools, 2020, and my apologies, the book, it's Fault Lines, a primer on race, science and society. And finally, Learning Under Lockdown, Voices of South Africa's Students. Professor Jansen, over to you, and thank you once again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Maria, and welcome to all of you involved, especially in this very vital resource that we call school libraries. So I want to just reflect on inequality and how that plays out in education during the pandemic. Now, let's start by saying the obvious, and that is that we have always had deep inequalities in our school system, inequalities between the 20% of schools that serve children of the privileged and 80% of children who were forced to learn in schools that are disadvantaged in varying degrees. So the inequalities have already existed, and we've provided really good empirical work, I think, in our book last year called South African Schooling, The Enigma of Inequality, which you just heard about with my colleague Nick Spall. And so the inequalities are there and have been there for centuries. What COVID did was, of course, to make those inequalities very visible in a way that you could not look away. You could not ignore the fact, as South Africans, we sort of get so used to these gross inequalities in our society and in education in particular. We sort of tolerate it. We just sort of, move on in order just to stay sane. But I find it very difficult as somebody who visits schools on a regular basis in the 9 provinces. I find it very difficult to, on a one day, go to a really well-resourced school, and an hour later, I'm in a very disadvantaged school where kids, use split latrines as their toilets, and where half the teachers are absent, and the school looks like a dump site. It's very hard in my spirituality, in my humanity, in my theology, in everything that is, that makes us human, just to accept those inequalities. And what COVID did was to, of course, blow it up in our faces, in the consequences of which we will see for many generations to come. I'll say more about that in a minute. And so a lot of my research over the past few years, especially, has focused on drawing attention of the policymakers and the politicians on the one hand, but also the parents and the practitioners on the other hand, the teachers, to this thing that to this inequality. And so one way to get at that was to invite on my Facebook and Twitter pages children to write their stories of learning under lockdown. And so we sent out this invitation, and honestly, I thought we'd get about 100 children maybe writing their stories. And I, of course, gave them some guidance as to what to write about, which was, how are you coping with the lockdown? You know, how are you accessing online learning, if at all? How are you dealing with isolation from your classmates and that kind of thing? But instead of getting 100, which I thought was optimistic, we got 640 stories from all 9 provinces and a few from outside the country, from Botswana all the way through to California in the US. Children wrote because Twitter and Facebook are public, you know, spaces. And out of the 640 student stories, we chose and could only choose 400 of the best. And we put them in a book which is now available in CNA for 99 rands, called Learning Under Lockdown. Now, I have to say, you know, as a hardened veteran of the public school system, you know, nothing moves me very easily anymore, you know, but I tell you, I was very emotional as I read through those stories, because it was, you know, they included stories of incredible hardship, which I'll talk about now, stories of incredible emotional stress, stories of hopelessness, particularly for young people, not sure whether, you know, and when schools would reopen and when the virus would go away one day. And yet at the same time, incredible stories of resilience, of toughness, of determination, of coping in ways that I did not always anticipate. And so what does one do with these inequalities? Because when you listen to the Minister of Education speak, you could swear she's speaking to one school system when she's in fact speaking to 2 or 3 school systems, you know, when the resolutions around examinations are made as if you're talking to St. Cyprian's in Cape Town and to, you know, St. John's in Johannesburg or Maritzburg College in Pietermaritzburg. You can't have as a norm schools that are well-resourced and well-equipped for the crisis, when all of our schools should form part of the frame with which you talk about things like exams, and in the context of today, things like library services. And when we get lulled into that kind of, you know, sleep, falling asleep on the train of injustice, then of course the consequences will pass us by without us doing anything about it. So what I do about it is, like with Learning Under Lockdown, we choose 400 stories we bring to the public's attention in a cheap book, as I said, 99 rand. Every cent we make from the book goes towards a school nutrition program in schools nominated by the children whose stories were accepted. So all the money goes. The printer for the book, he literally printed it for 13 cents a book, which is a loss actually. And for small businesses, you can imagine this is a big thing. But Rodney Maharaj wanted to do this because it's his contribution. Benjamin Frisk, the owner of CNA, wants to do this because it's his contribution to sell the book for cheap. And whatever we make goes back into the schools. I'm telling you that story simply to demonstrate how in a simple, small act, you can act justly with respect to this injustice called the school system. What we learned, and this has direct implications for how we think of library services during COVID, this COVID period, we found that there were 3 ways in which children were accessing learning or not. In the first case, you had the fancy schools. I mentioned St. Cyprian's, St. John's, take your pick, you know, Westfield Girls in Durban. You can go across the country. They went fairly seamlessly from face-to-face teaching to fully online teaching. And one of the reasons the 20% of schools could do that is that they were already experimenting pre-COVID with what is called blended learning. Now, the children already had face-to-face, and Google Classroom or one of those many other platforms as a way of continuing interaction with the school from home before the lockdown. So when the lockdown came, what these schools could do fairly easily was simply to switch off the one button and to switch on the other button, just like that. Now, of course, it helps that those kids were in homes where there was enough broadband, there was enough, adequate Wi-Fi connections, reliable Wi-Fi connections. Parents were already using those kinds of tools. And so there is no interruption whatsoever, in the learning of those children. At the other extreme, you had children who had absolutely no access whatsoever to their schools or to their teachers. Nothing, zilch. They were lucky if they took, at the point of lockdown, which started just before the holidays, I think a week or two earlier, if they took home some written texts and so on and so forth. But by and large, they had nothing and they couldn't contact the school. And then in the middle, there's a whole range of schools in which we call the medium tech schools. The kids may or may not have had access to data and devices. This was very much dependent on whether the parent was using a cell phone and whether, they could stand off or share that device for an hour or two a day, and whether the family could afford data. Data becomes a huge thing in terms of your accessibility. And even if you had data and devices, for many of these children, the internet connection was unreliable, so you may or may not have had internet. What happened in this case, pedagogically speaking, is that very often this teacher, an enterprising teacher, would download content onto a WhatsApp group in order for the kids to access downloaded content. And then the kid would do some assignments and then upload it again and send it to the teacher. Again, all of this is precarious because it depends very much on whether there was data, devices, and a reliable server. So those children were obviously the most frustrated because they were neither fully online nor were they fully offline. They were sort of caught in this middle period and so on. Now, I want you to imagine if academic outcomes were already unequal before the pandemic, it now becomes exacerbated. In other words, it becomes much worse. And that is why I suggested that we don't try and rescue the school year. It's lost already, and we try and figure out how you can make up, not at the output side, but at the input side, something more equal by extending the school year into next year. Pass everybody except for the grade 12s and make sure that we redo the school year in 2021, in which, for example, for kids who are in grade 3 today, they would do a mix of grade 3 and grade 4 in 2021. That's what Kenya is doing, by the way. That's what smart countries do, but not us, because we really believe that this is a miracle nation that can, we like the United States in many ways. You just sort of believe that the virus will miraculously disappear, according to Mr. Trump, or, in our own sort of imaginations, racism will miraculously disappear, as clicks try to remind us that it doesn't quite work that way. And so we live with a norm that is not real because it doesn't deal with these inequalities, etc. So if you don't deal with it at the input side, of course, what South Africa does is deal with it at the output side. So now we're going to have an exam. I have it on good authority. They're going to share the scope of the examination in all the subjects for the kids. I have it on good authority that the standardization process of the matric results is going to allow for much more latitude given the pandemic. On one hand, you understand that kind of adjustments that must be made because it's not the children's fault or the teacher's fault that there's a pandemic. At the same time, we have to ask, what do you give up when you try and fix the system at the output side? Because then there's a quality problem, both in terms of the students who register for university, as well as those who go directly into work. What does that mean? Is that we've lied to the young people. We've given them a certificate that doesn't bear the name certificate. better to fix this thing at the input side than to have all these shenanigans at the output side of the system. The inequality, in other words, doesn't go away. So this has huge implications, obviously, for how we rethink education in the future. And I really do believe that we're going to have to do some hard thinking, reimagining the school system and indeed the library system that supports children in an unequal country such as ours going into the future. So let me give you one example of what I'm working on with schools, and then I'm going to ask you to think of its parallel when one works with universities. So when one works with schools, for me, we're developing now the concept of a micro school and giving it a particularly South African flavor. And what this basically means is we want to cater for children who either are dropping out, particularly boys, are dropping out of school simply because, of the turbulence within the public school system. And then there are children whose parents are keeping them back from going to school, especially working class parents who are sort of saying, the risk of my child being infected or infecting us when they come home is too great. What we're going to be doing is just keep them at home and find some other way of interacting with the school. Fine, but that's not education. That's not a quality education. So I want to prove that an online education for children of the poor is not an oxymoron. In other words, you can make those two things come together and fit, even though it sounds ridiculous, right? So the micro school provides the children with 3 hours of instruction every day by high quality teachers in math, science, physics, and so on, from grades 10 to 12 initially, and that they then have a device and unlimited data for continuing their learning at home. So the kids come to a very safe space in which all the mitigating factors are in place to ensure they stay healthy. And then they go home and they're learning how to interact with the school through data, through devices that are data loaded, and enable them then to have the best of both worlds, the best of quality face-to-face teaching for a limited period of time a day and quality online learning that is undisturbed as they move between this micro school and the home environment. Why is this necessary? For 2 reasons. We know that from epidemiologists that this coronavirus is new, yes, that's why they call it novel, but it's also not going to go away soon, just like the flu virus didn't disappear. Okay, the flu virus from 1918 is still with us today, and while we might have treatments, you never really completely cured from flu infections. And the problem with the coronavirus is actually much more dangerous, as you know, much more deadly than flu, and so much more infectious. And so what we need to do, obviously, is to prepare for a future in which lockdowns of various kinds might still be our lot, might still be with us. And then, of course, there's a second reason we need to think like this, is that the world has changed in terms of infectious diseases. If you listen again to the experts, what's becoming very, very clear is that we might very well, into the future, have to deal with the reality of new infections, new viruses, other pathogens that might again force the closing down of schools and school and society. In other words, lockdowns into the future. But even if that doesn't happen, which I doubt, even if those things don't happen, it is surely an opportunity for us to move our school system out of the 19th century into the 21st century and rethink the role of technology, of information technology especially, in relation to quality schooling for all our children. And this, I think, is where I want to put out the challenge to our librarians, particularly our school librarians, and say, who is leading the charge? Who is leading the country at the moment on this question? And that is, what does the future of the public library look like? How can we reimagine it in a post-COVID world? And if there isn't, hopefully there is, but if there isn't a professional community of librarians doing this, and I want to say to you, you're not doing your job, okay? Because it's not only asking that question in relation to the country as a whole, but asking that question in relation to those who have less access to this critical information that might continue their education. So let me throw out, I'm not a librarian, obviously I don't have the expertise in the field, but I am a user of libraries, both online and physically. So let me just throw out a few suggestions of what might be part of a complete reimagination of the public library going into the future. The first thing that becomes really, really important is knowing your customer profile. You can no longer run a public library as if every child is the same. They're not. They don't come from the same resource backgrounds, from the same kinds of schools, the same kinds of homes, and therefore, whatever the reimagined public library system looks like, it's got to take account in design terms of the new client, for want of a better term. It's knowing your customer profile, even as you reimagine the public library system. Secondly, need I say this, and it's come up already, is you need to in-skill yourself. You've got to make sure that those frontline people who work in libraries are fluent in at least 3 or 4 different kinds of online platforms with which to interact with the public. If you're not doing that, if that's not the next big investment, okay, then simply working, if I may be so tongue-in-cheek, if the only thing is to learn the Dewey Decimal System, I just don't see how you are making yourself relevant to the 21st century. Number 3, I really do believe that in this crisis, the library has to see itself as an extension of the public school. In other words, in curriculum terms, the library has to be one additional resource that reinforces what might be missed out, particularly for the children of the poor, as a consequence of the lockdown. And that means, for one, the ability to offer virtual classes from the resource base of a library as part of a way of reaching out to more, not just broadcast education with all its dilemmas I'm discovering when it comes to SABC, ETV, and other digital and also non-digital options in the broadcast media. What about libraries as virtual classrooms in which we can teach in line with the CAPS curriculum, and hopefully in a much more interesting way than we often do? That means that the library's website will tell you immediately whether that library is part of the 21st century solution to a more just and equal access to the curriculum, or whether it's simply another lopsided, poorly managed site that hardly gives you access to basic information, and so on. So an inventive person leading this reimagination discussion of the public library will be somebody who pays attention to the design and the creativity of the library website. I just cannot see why we cannot, through those websites, offer podcasts, offer access to audiobooks, offer access to the streaming of films and documentaries in such a way that we allow young people to access quality information from wherever they are. That raises the issue of the selection and the curation of resources that are not only relevant but lively and creative and life-changing for young people to access on a 24/7 basis. This is a very different kind of library from the one I grew up in, or the ones many of you grew up in, and it will require a new thinking, as I called it, a new imagination about the library. So let's not fool each other in conclusion that what we're doing is simply to provide a uniform intervention through the public library system in order to reach children. That's not possible. We need to do this in ways that makes accessibility possible for those who are through no fault of their own, disadvantaged in this crisis, and whose education outcomes will lag further behind unless we do something different in the context of public libraries and the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Jansen, especially for opening our eyes and also giving us a new perspective on the school system and showing us that there is a difference. How can I put it? There are different students coming from different societies, and that we cannot just always assume that students are all equipped with the latest technology and they are all skilled into moving from high school to university.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.